Welcome to the RPTM podcast, the show that breaks down the myths of monolithic history and tells our story through multiple lenses. I'm your host, Professor RyanGLancaster. Today's episode is partially underwritten by you, the listener. Find out ways to support the podcast on my website, RyanGLancaster.com. Episode 37, Seneca Falls and the Cult of Domesticity. The next rule of history, expertise, as we understand it, is mainly fake. In academia, there's a saying that instead of measuring what we value what we can measure. Researchers can manipulate numbers and facts to support any hypothesis or be a stronghold for any confirmation bias. But history academics also rely on non-statistical data, meaning you read history and try to get some lessons, and historical specialization can cause an issue with academic learning. Specialization sounds good and is ultimately rooted in a desire for a more egalitarian intellectual culture. In this way of thinking, a PhD is just as much of a doctor as a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and has much more credibility in any field. Not anyone can engage in careful analysis of data in a way that can withstand scrutiny, but lower the standards enough and create enough areas, and a lot of people can be experts. Since people aren't getting more competent, more experts means that the average intelligence of those influencing public policy drops. Part of the reason that specialization is terrible is that people have to justify the field's existence. Some historians have some terrible takes just because they need to be original to get published. Don't tune into History Channel and expect to find much involving history. Historical thought has given up its death rattle and has been replaced by reality shows. And this happens because of how the world works. There are two kinds of people: those who don't care about past events and who soak it in. You can guess which sample size would be more prominent. An alternative now is video platforms like YouTube. As a form of social media, YouTube has moved beyond vapid videos of cute animals to something where historians can discuss every topic under the sun. This ubiquitous social media allows those interested in history to find an audience, which is a good thing. However, this new trend has a downside. Everyone with a camera can press record and spout off their knowledge. Many of the history videos on YouTube look great, but the information presented rarely goes into depth. Instead of documentaries with multiple sources, we are presented with highly polished lectures that give one person's take on past events or items from history. Rarely do these individuals offer what research they did or how they drew their conclusions. In some cases, the information is inaccurate or worse, biased. There ends up being a lot of false information. YouTube has provided a platform for conspiracy theorists and worse to spread their narrative. Virtually anyone can set themselves up as a knowledgeable source. The narrators of these videos talk to the camera as if they are definitive experts on the said subject. Throughout history, readers have been required to weigh the quality of research. In the past, this has been done by following footnotes in bibliographies. A reader could always check a writer's sources to determine whether the printed material was inaccurate or exciting. As we understand, it is mainly fake. This is a dilemma then. Trust the experts can lead the public astray, and so does don't trust the experts. While that's an issue for most people, for intellectuals the problem is more solvable. When you don't have the time to research something for yourself, you trust those who have good intellectual habits.
John Fremont. John Charles Fremont was an explorer of the western United States, military officer, and politician. He was a U.S. Senator from California, and in 1856 was the first Republican nominee for President of the United States. A native of Georgia, he was an opponent of slavery and participated in the California Genocide. In the 1840s, Fremont led 5 expeditions into the western United States. While on the third expedition, he and his men committed several massacres against Native Americans in California. During the Mexican-American War, Fremont, a major in the U.S. Army, took control of California from the California Republic in 1846. Fremont was convicted in a court-martial for mutiny and insubordination after a conflict over the rightful military governor of California. After his sentence was commuted and President Polk reinstated him, Fremont resigned from the army. Afterward, Fremont settled in California, Monterey, while buying cheap land in the Sierra foothills. When gold was found on his Mariposa ranch, Fremont became a wealthy man during the California Gold Rush. Fremont became one of the first 2 U.S. senators elected from the new state of California in 1850. Fremont was the first presidential candidate of the new Republican Party, carrying most of the North. He lost the 1856 presidential election to Democrat James Buchanan when Know-Nothings split the vote. At the beginning of the American Civil War in 1861, he was given command of the Department of the West by President Abraham Lincoln. Although Fremont had successes during his brief tenure there, he ran his department autocratically and made hasty decisions without consulting President Lincoln or Army headquarters. He issued an unauthorized emancipation edict, and was relieved of his command for insubordination by Lincoln. After a brief service tenure in the Mountain Department in 1862, Fremont resided in New York, retiring from the Army in 1864. Fremont was nominated for president in 1864 by the Radical Democracy Party, a breakaway faction of abolitionist Republicans, but he withdrew before the election. After the Civil War, Fremont lost much of his wealth in the unsuccessful Pacific Railroad in 1866 and lost more in the Panic of 1873. Fremont served as governor of Arizona from 1878 to 1881. After his resignation as governor, Fremont retired from politics and died destitute in New York City in 1890. Historians portray Fremont as controversial, reckless, and contradictory. Some scholars regard him as a military hero of significant accomplishment, while others view him as a failure who repeatedly defeated his own best purposes. Several historians argue that the keys to Fremont's character and personality lie in his being born illegitimate, and in his ambitious drive for success, self-justification, and passive-aggressive behavior. His direct involvement in the California genocide of Native Americans has also diminished his historical reputation. Fremont lived a dramatic life of remarkable successes and dismal failures. Although Fremont was often caught up in controversy, he played a significant role in opening up the American West to settlement by American pioneers, in part by attacks on Native Americans. His reliable accounts, including published maps, narrations, and scientific documentation of his expeditions, guided American emigrants overland into the West starting in the mid-1840s. Fremont, popularly known as the Pathfinder during his times, was considered an American hero. Many people believed that Fremont's arrest and court-martial by Kearny during the Mexican-American War were unjustified. During the Civil War, Fremont's victory over the Confederates at Springfield was the only successful Union battle in the Western Department in 1861. Fremont's reputation, however, was damaged after he was relieved of command by Lincoln for insubordination. After leaving the Mountain Department in 1862, Fremont's active service career in the war virtually ended. Fremont's 1861 promotion of Ulysses S. Grant, going against the grain of Army gossip, was fruitful. Grant became the most significant Union general. He invested heavily in the railroad industry, but the Panic of 1873 wiped out Fremont's fortune, and his appearance after that looked tired and aging. Fremont is remembered for planting the American flag on the Rocky Mountains during his first expedition, symbolically claiming the West for the United States. For his botanical records and information collected on his explorations, many plants are named in honor of Fremont. A giant statue/sculpture of Fremont is displayed at Pathfinder Regional Park near Florence, Colorado. Fremont coined the phrase Golden Gate for the strait between Marin County and San Francisco County in his memoirs. There were two fascinating things about Fremont. The first was the unfailing drama of his life, a life wrought out of the fiercest storms and most radiant bursts of sunshine. The second was Fremont's dramatic career. How could the man who sometimes succeeded so dazzlingly at other times fail so abysmally? Fremont's psychological problem was in part attributed to his inheritance of impulsiveness and brilliancy from his emotionally and ill-balanced parents. Fremont was encouraged by his parents to heighten his inherited self-reliant, heedless, and adventuresome traits, and that he lacked the discipline his passionate spirit and quick mind most needed. Concerning Fremont's tenure as commander of the West, Lincoln thought Fremont was personally honest, but his cardinal mistake was that he isolates himself, and allows nobody to see him, and by which he does not know what is going on in the very matter he is dealing with. Many historians agree with Lincoln.
Cult of domesticity. The cult of domesticity or cult of true womanhood is a term used by historians to describe what they consider a prevailing value system among the upper and middle classes during the 19th century in the United States. This value system emphasized new ideas of femininity, the woman's role within the home, and work and family dynamics. True women, according to this idea, were supposed to possess four cardinal virtues: piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. The argument revolved around the woman being the center of the family. She was considered the light of the home. The women and men who most actively promoted these standards were generally white and Protestant. The most prominent of them lived in New England and the northeastern United States. Although all women were supposed to emulate this ideal of femininity, Black, working class, and immigrant women were often excluded from the definition of true women because of social prejudice. Since Barbara Welter first advanced the idea in 1966, many historians have argued that the subject is far more complex and nuanced than terms such as cult of domesticity or true womanhood suggest, and that the roles played by and expected of women within the middle class, 19th century context were quite varied and often contradictory. For example, it has been argued that much of what has been considered as anti-feminist in the past helped lead to feminism. Part of the separate spheres ideology, the cult of domesticity identified the home as women's proper sphere. Women were supposed to inhabit the private sphere, run the household and produce food, rearing the children, and take care of the husband. True women were to hold and practice the four cardinal virtues. Piety, religion was valued because, unlike intellectual pursuits, it did not take a woman away from her proper sphere, the home, and because it controlled women's longings. Purity, virginity, a woman's greatest treasure, must not be lost until her marriage night, and a married woman had to remain committed only to her husband. Submission, true women were required to be as submissive and obedient as little children because men were regarded as women's superiors by God's appointment. Domesticity, a woman's proper place was in the home, and her role as a wife was to create a refuge for her husband and children. Cooking, needlework, making beds, and tending flowers were considered naturally feminine activities, whereas reading anything other than religious biographies was discouraged. An ideal true woman was frail, too mentally and physically weak to leave her home. The care of her home supposedly made her feminine, and she depended on men to protect her within the shelter of it. Wilma Mankiller agrees, claiming that a true woman was expected to be delicate, soft, and weak. She should not engage in strenuous physical activity that would damage her much more delicate nervous system. Historians have also described an overlapping but competing ideology that called the ideal of real womanhood, in which women were encouraged to be physically fit and active, involved in their communities, well-educated, and artistically accomplished, although usually within the broader idea that women were best suited to the domestic sphere. The conflation of domesticity and true womanhood can be misleading because dedication to the domestic sphere did not necessarily imply purity, submission, or weakness. Preachers describe the characteristics of true womanhood in sermons, books, and religious texts, as well as women's magazines. Prescriptive literature advised women on how to transform their homes into domestic sanctuaries for their husbands and children. Magazines also stressed fashion because a woman had to stay up to date to please her husband. Instructions for sewists were often included in magazines. Magazines that promoted the cult of domesticity values fared better financially than those competing magazines, which offered a more progressive view in terms of women's roles. In the United States, Peterson's Magazine and Godey's Lady's Book were the most widely circulated women's magazines and popular among women and men. With a circulation of 150,000 by 1860, Godey's reflected and supported some of the ideals of the cult of true womanhood. The magazine's paintings and pictures illustrated the four virtues, often showing women with children or behind husbands. It also equated womanhood with motherhood and being a wife, declaring that the perfection of womanhood is the wife and mother. The magazine presented motherhood as a woman's natural and most satisfying role and encouraged women to find their fulfillment and contributions to society, mainly within the home. At the same time, the longtime editor of Godey's, Sarah Josepha Hale, encouraged women to improve themselves intellectually, write, and act to enhance the moral character of their communities and their nation. Hale advocated for female physicians and published many of the most influential female writers of the 19th century. The cult of domesticity affected married women's labor market participation in the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. True women were supposed to devote themselves to unpaid domestic labor and refrain from paid, market-oriented work. Consequently, in 1890, 4.5% of all married women were gainfully employed, compared with 40.5% of single women. However, women's complete financial dependence upon their husbands proved disastrous when wives lost their husbands through death or desertion and were forced to fend for themselves and their children. This division between the domestic and public spheres had effects on women's power and status. In a society as a whole, particularly in political and economic arenas, women's power declined. Within the home, however, they gained symbolic power. The legal implications of this ideology included the passage of protective labor laws, which also limited women's employment opportunities outside the home. These laws and subsequent Supreme Court rulings such as Muller v. Oregon assumed that women's primary role was that of mother and wife and that women's non-domestic work should not interfere with their primary function. As a result, women's working hours were limited, and night work for women was prohibited, essentially costing many female workers their jobs and excluding them from many occupations. The cult of domesticity privatized women's options for work, for education, for voicing opinions, or for supporting reform. Arguments of significant biological differences between the sexes led to pronouncements that women were incapable of effectively participating in the realms of politics, commerce, or public service. Women were seen as better suited to parenting. Also, because of the expected behaviors, women were assumed to make better teachers of younger children. One of the first public jobs for women was teaching. One estimate says that, with the growth of public education in the northern tier of states, 1/4 of all native-born Massachusetts women between 1825 and 1860 were schoolteachers at some point in their lives. Women's rights advocates of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, such as Mary Wollstonecraft, Frances Wright, and Harriet Martineau, were widely accused of disrupting the natural order of things and condemned as unfeminine. However, after the Jacksonian era saw the expansion of voting rights to virtually all white males in the United States, many women believed it was their opportunity for increased civil liberties. Early feminist opposition to many of the values promoted by the cult of domesticity, especially concerning women's suffrage, political activism, and legal independence, culminated in the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848.
Seneca Falls Convention. The Seneca Falls Convention was the first women's rights convention in the United States. Held in July 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, the meeting launched the women's suffrage movement, which more than 7 decades later ensured women the right to vote. Originally known as the Women's Rights Convention, the Seneca Falls Convention fought for women's social, civil, and religious rights. From July 19 to 20, 1848, the meeting was held at the Wesleyan Chapel in Seneca Falls, New York. Despite scarce publicity, 300 people, mainly area residents, showed up. Only women were allowed to attend, but the second day was open to men. The convention proceeded to discuss the 11 resolutions on women's rights. All passed unanimously except for the 9th resolution, which demanded the right to vote for women. Stanton and African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass gave impassioned speeches in its defense before it eventually, and barely, passed. The 5 women who organized the Seneca Falls Convention were also active in the abolitionist movement, which called for an end to slavery and racial discrimination. They included Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading women's rights advocate, was a driving organizer of the Seneca Falls Convention. After talking to her father, a law professor, and his students, Stanton first became invested in women's rights. She studied at Troy Female Seminary, and worked on women's property rights reform in the early 1840s. Lucretia Mott, a Quaker preacher from Philadelphia, was known for her anti-slavery, women's rights, and religious reform activism. Mary McClintock, the daughter of Quaker anti-slavery, temperance, and women's rights activists. In 1833, McClintock and Mott organized the Philadelphia Female Anti-Slavery Society. At the Seneca Falls Convention, McClintock was appointed secretary. Martha Coffin Wright, Lucretia Mott's sister. In addition, being a lifelong proponent of women's rights, she was an abolitionist who ran a station on the Underground Railroad from her Auburn, New York home. Jane Hunt, another Quaker activist, was a member of McClintock's extended family through marriage. Stanton and Mott first met in London in 1840, attending the World Anti-Slavery Convention with their husbands. When the convention excluded women delegates solely based on their sex, the pair resolved to hold a women's rights convention. In the United States, women's rights reformers had already begun contending for women's rights to speak out on moral and political issues beginning in the 1830s. Around the same time in New York, where Stanton lived, legal reformers had been discussing equality and challenging state laws prohibiting married women from owning property. By 1848, equal rights for women was a divisive issue. In July of 1848, Stanton, frustrated with staying at home raising kids, convinced Mott, Wright, and McClintock to help organize the Seneca Falls Convention and write its main manifesto, the Declaration of Sentiments. Together, the 5 women drafted a notice to announce a convention to discuss women's social, civic and religious condition and rights around Hunt's tea table. The Declaration of Sentiments was the Seneca Falls Convention's manifesto that described women's grievances and demands. Written primarily by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, it called on women to fight for their constitutionally guaranteed right to equality as U.S. citizens. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal, the document stated. Inspired by the Declaration of Independence, the Declaration of Sentiments asserted women's equality in politics, family, education, jobs, religion, and morals. The Declaration began with 19 abuses and usurpations that were destined to destroy a woman's confidence in her powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and abject life. Because women didn't have the right to vote, a right given to the most ignorant and degraded men, they were forced to submit to laws to which they did not consent. Women were denied an education, and issued a subordinate role in the church. Moreover, women were required to be obedient to their husbands and prevented from owning property, including their wages, which technically belonged to their husbands. And they received unequal rights upon divorce. In light of these abuses, the Declaration called on women to throw off such government. Next came a list of 11 resolutions, which demanded women be regarded as men's equals. The resolutions called on Americans to obey any laws that placed women in an inferior position to men as having no force or authority. They resolved for women to have equal rights within the church and equal access to jobs. The 9th resolution was the most controversial, as it called women to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise or the right to vote. Although its passage led many women's rights proponents to withdraw their support, the 9th resolution went on to become the cornerstone of the women's suffrage movement. In New York and across the U.S., newspapers covered the convention, supporting and against its objectives. Horace Greeley, the influential editor of the New York Tribune, echoed many people's opinions at the time. While skeptical of giving women the right to vote, he argued that if Americans believed in the Constitution, women must attain equal rights. 2 weeks later, on August 2, 1848, the Seneca Falls Convention reconvened at the First Unitarian Church of Rochester, New York, to reaffirm the movement's goals with a larger audience. The convention's leaders continued to campaign for women's rights at the state and nationwide events in the following years. Reformers frequently referred to the Declaration of Sentiments as they campaigned for women's rights. Between 1848 and 1862, the participants of the Seneca Falls Convention used the Declaration of Sentiments to employ agents, circulate tracts, petition the state and national legislatures, and endeavor to enlist the pulpit and the press in our behalf. After 72 years of organized struggle, all American women finally achieved the same rights as men at the polling box when, in 1920, women won the right to vote with the passage of the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution.
Compromise of 1850. The Compromise of 1850 was a package of 5 separate bills passed by the United States Congress in September 1850 that diffused a political confrontation between slave and free states on territories acquired in the Mexican-American War. It also set Texas's western and northern borders and included provisions addressing fugitive slaves and the slave trade. The compromise was brokered by Whig Senator Henry Clay and Democratic Senator Stephen A. Douglas, with the support of President Millard Fillmore. 3 major types of issues were addressed by the Compromise of 1850. A variety of boundary issues. The status of territory issues. The issue of slavery. While capable of analytical distinction, leadership included the boundary and territory issues in the overarching issue of slavery. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery interests were each concerned with the amount of land on which slavery was permitted and the number of states in the slave or free camps. Since Texas was a slave state, not only the residents of that state but also both camps on a national scale had an interest in the size of Texas. A debate over slavery in the territories had erupted during the Mexican-American War. Many Southerners sought to expand slavery to the newly acquired lands, and many Northerners opposed any such expansion. The debate was further complicated by Texas's claim to all former Mexican territory north and east of the Rio Grande, including areas it had never effectively controlled. These issues prevented the passage of organic acts to create organized territorial governments for the land acquired in the Mexican-American War. In early 1850, Clay proposed a package of 8 bills that would settle most of the pressing issues before Congress. Clay's proposal was opposed by President Zachary Taylor, anti-slavery Whigs like William Seward, and pro-slavery Democrats like John C. Calhoun, and congressional debate over the territories continued. The debates over the bill were the most famous in congressional history, and the divisions devolved into fistfights and drawn guns on the floor of Congress. After Taylor died and was succeeded by Fillmore, Douglas took the lead in passing Clay's compromise through Congress as 5 separate bills. Under the compromise, Texas surrendered its claims to present-day New Mexico and other states in return for federal assumption of Texas's public debt. California was admitted as a free state, while leadership organized the remaining portions of the Mexican cession into New Mexico Territory and Utah Territory. Under the concept of popular sovereignty, the people of each territory would decide whether or not slavery would be permitted. Perhaps the most crucial part of the compromise received the least attention during debates. Enacted September 18, 1850, it is informally known as the Fugitive Slave Law or the Fugitive Slave Act. It bolstered the Fugitive Slave Act of 1793. The new version of the Fugitive Slave Law now required federal judicial officials in all states and federal territories, including free states, to return escaped slaves to their masters in slave states. Any federal marshal or other officials who did not arrest an alleged runaway slave was liable to a fine of $1,000, equivalent to $30,000 in 2020. Law enforcement everywhere in the U.S. now had a duty to arrest anyone suspected of being a fugitive slave on no more evidence than a claimant's sworn testimony of ownership. Suspected slaves could neither ask for a jury trial nor testify on their behalf. Also, aiding a runaway slave by providing food or shelter was now a crime nationwide, punished by 6 months' imprisonment and a $1,000 fine. Officers capturing a fugitive slave were entitled to a fee for their work, and this expense was to be paid by the federal government. the law was so completely pro-slavery as to prohibit the admission of the testimony of a person accused of being an escaped slave into evidence at the judicial hearing to determine the status of the accused escaped slave. Thus, if free blacks were claimed to be escaped slaves, they could not resist returning to slavery by truthfully telling their actual history. Furthermore, the federal commissioners overseeing the hearings were paid $5 for ruling a person was free but were paid $10 for determining they were a slave, thus providing a financial incentive to always rule in favor of slavery regardless of the evidence. The law further exacerbated the problem of free blacks being kidnapped and sold as slaves. The Fugitive Slave Act was essential to meet Southern demands. In terms of public opinion in the North, the necessary provision was that ordinary citizens were required to aid slave catchers and made it a crime to assist a fugitive. Many Northerners deeply resented these requirements. Resentment towards the act further heightened tensions between the North and South, which were inflamed further by abolitionists such as Harriet Beecher Stowe. Her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, stressed the horrors of recapturing escaped slaves and outraged Southerners. A statute enacted as part of the Compromise prohibited the slave trade in Washington, D.C., but not slave ownership. Alarmed and outraged, Southerners in Congress were unanimous in opposing the provision, seen as a concession to the abolitionists and a bad precedent, but they were outvoted. However, Washington's residents could still easily buy and sell slaves in the nearby states of Virginia and Maryland. The issue of slavery in the territories would be reopened by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, but the Compromise of 1850 played a significant role in postponing the American Civil War.
You've been listening to the RPTM podcast. If you like what you hear, please rate us on whatever platform you're listening on. Join us again next week when we talk about the seen and unseen of U.S. history. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. Also, for more information, check out the show notes on my website. The show was produced by me. Our editor is me. Written and researched by me. Music is Down South by Bliv Beats. I'm Ryan Lancaster, and this was the RPTM podcast.